We have Emily next, and then after that we'll do Robin. And then if anyone has sort of questions or comments you want to get in line for several minutes from now, you can send them in the chat. All right, Emily.
Okay, so first I'd like to say that I'm so delighted to be included in this celebratory event. I'd like to thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to be here. And Ross, many congratulations on this wonderful achievement. I was thinking as Dan was talking about how long I've known you, and we overlapped in Chicago as grad students on opposite sides of the city, but I think I met you at a conference far away from home. So, and it's been, by my calculations, maybe more than a decade. So congratulations. I really can't wait to hear what today's conversation is going to yield, sparked by your terrific book, which I loved and I learned all kinds of new things from. So it was not only incredibly informative and provocative, but as Dan said, it's a real pleasure read. And that always doesn't happen. Like sometimes I think, books can be really edifying, but are not exactly a treat to read. But this was a real pleasure read as well. So in the spirit of full disclosure, I have just finished reviewing the book for Perspectives on Politics, which I think Sarah and maybe Ross know. And so my comments for today are going to draw very heavily on what I wrote for that review. So it's a little bit of a preview of coming attractions. So without further ado, let me turn to the book. I think there'll be some overlap with Dan's comments as well, which is nice. So what is the proper place of humor, especially ridicule in politics? Does ridicule damage the fabric of social life by making some individuals or groups the unfortunate targets of mirth? Can it conversely strengthen bonds via shared laughter that travels across the differences that separate us? Or politically, is ridicule a tool that can be used to dismantle hierarchies and challenge people with power? Or does it simply reinforce hierarchies and humiliate the already vulnerable? So I think I'm beginning with the questions that Dan was really thinking about towards the end of his comments. And these are the important questions at the heart of Uncivil Mirth. And in this excellent monograph, I think Ross very wisely avoids any attempt to settle these questions for us definitively, but instead, through really meticulous historical and interpretive work, he shows their vital political significance to 18th century thinkers. And he suggests that 21st century people would do well to think more critically about the potential uses and abuses of ridicule in our specific contexts. So in Uncivil Mirth, Ross accomplishes several difficult tasks at once. So this will be a little bit in the way of summary, but I hope for those of you who haven't read it, it will be an enticing summary that will make you rush out and grab the book. So first, I think he offers readers a new narrative about the shape of British political thought in the long 18th century by centering debates about humor. Through careful research, he shows us how debates about the use and abuse of humor and laughter were really at the core of political disputes in early modern Britain, those over religious difference and toleration, the abolition of slavery, and the persistence of entrenched social hierarchies, including but not limited to patriarchy. Second, Ross takes very well-known figures in the history of British political thought, such as Hobbes, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, David Hume, and Mary Wollstonecraft, and by guiding readers through their subtle and complicated engagements with the problem of humor, he gives us novel interpretations of their political writing. So really, I think he takes these deeply familiar thinkers and makes them unfamiliar again, which is really no mean feat. At the same time, for me at least, Uncivil Mirth also shines a very welcome spotlight on political thinkers and movements that I think are unfortunately less well known to many political theorists. Here I'm thinking about the Aberdonian common sense philosophers whose theories of humor challenged both Humean skepticism and the structure of group relations in commercial society, and the Scottish abolitionists who weighed whether ridicule ought to replace reasoned argument as an effective means of highlighting the inhumane cruelty of the Atlantic slave trade. And then lastly, Ross notes that although the 18th century debate on the political role of humor, sparked by Shaftesbury's and to a great degree also by Hobbes's reflections, has, and this is page 214, has long petered out, but the problems that inspired it are still very much with us. We too should focus our attention on, to use Ross's language, both the style and content of political humor, and critically evaluate how it operates for better and worse ends in our politics. So in a short set of comments, it's impossible to do justice to the full scope of a rich study like this, which interprets these sort of more well-known moral and political treatises alongside letters, pamphlets, and ephemera to make its case for vibrant 18th century British engagement with the morality and politics of humor. And I think different readers, depending on their scholarly interests, are, I think, quite likely to find themselves especially captivated by particular chapters of the book. I'll say which ones captured me, and I will also say that they surprised me. I really thought that the high point for me would be the first part of the book, with its focus on Hobbes and especially Shaftesbury and some Mandeville. That was really what I expected to latch onto. But instead, for me, it was really the concluding chapters of the book on the Scottish abolitionists and Wollstonecraft that gripped me the most. From an interpretive standpoint, I think they really show how arguments about the place of wit, humor, and laughter instantiated by earlier figures like Hobbes and Shaftesbury are stretched and molded and fitted to specific debates that arise later in British political history. So I think in some sense, these two ending chapters constitute both the conclusion and the apex of the entire story. And I thought it was a really great finish. These chapters also, I think, illuminate an argument that Ross stresses throughout his account of Enlightenment in Britain, which is that it's absolutely an open question whether the rhetorical and political practice of ridicule can support emancipatory political projects. And choosing whether to employ it ends up being a matter of context-dependent political judgment at all times. So each of these two chapters features this argument in a different way. So I'm going to dig into them a little bit here. So chapter 5 of the book interprets the work of Scottish polemicists who, while dissimilar in their backgrounds, careers, and general political leanings, were all keen, and this is Ross's language from page 151, to deploy ridicule against what they took to be the gravest of social evils, the European enslavement of Africans, unquote. Taking their cue from the notoriously ironical and difficult chapter on slavery and Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, these polemicists, among them James Ramsay, William Dixon, James Tytler, and Alexander Geddes, marshaled the forces of biting irony and satire to stage a rhetorical intervention on behalf of abolition, in contrast to some of the more sober moral and religious arguments offered by their allies in the cause. Ross deftly works through their complicated polemics, not the least of which is the clever and startling 1792 satire Petition of the Sharks of Africa to the House of Commons, to lay bare the genuine risks of deploying ridicule to confront the most urgent moral and political questions. On the one hand, claims and arguments in favor of slavery were deemed by many to be too morally abhorrent to even dignify an in-kind response in the form of a reasoned counter-argument. So enter ridicule, another potential means of destabilizing the status quo via ironical send-ups of different arguments for the continuation of the slave trade. On the other hand, as a political tactic, satirizing pro-slavery arguments and polemics carried some very particular dangers. As Ross documents, some abolitionists worried that readers would either unintentionally mistake or purposefully misrepresent satirical tracts as serious arguments for perpetuating the enslavement and trading of African people. Further, the turn to satire posed an additional risk. Weaponizing humor to fight the so-called arguments offered by the pro-slavery side could belie the absolute moral seriousness of the issue at hand. Working through the double-edged nature of ridicule in the context of these abolition debates, I think Ross really shows us both its promise and limitations for addressing the most serious political problems. It has the potential to serve as a kind of refusal, an outright rejection of the basic terms of a political debate. And I think that's extremely powerful. And yet, ridicule can also be easily claimed by the side it aims to contest and then co-opted in service of the very projects that the humorist rejects. I think Ross's chapter on Wollstonecraft continues some of these themes of the chapter on the Scottish abolitionists, namely the idea that ridicule might be used to unseat entrenched prejudices. And Dan spoke about this in his comments as well. And so in this chapter, I think Ross takes on a perceived double standard that some interpreters find in Wollstonecraft's work. In her critiques of Burke, she faults him for ridiculing his opponents instead of treating them with respect. Yet in her opposition to Burke, she leads off by heaping contempt and ridicule on his head. How can these two moves be reconciled? I think that Ross works well through this only apparent inconsistency by re-examining Wollstonecraft's entire body of work and coming to the persuasive conclusion that while she always held some qualms about ridicule, perhaps rightly, she also came to endorse it as a means of reversing the usual pathways traveled by contempt from the most powerful down to the vulnerable. Women and girls, the vulnerable parties she spends the most time thinking about, should learn to ridicule. And they should ridicule upwards, right? By meeting the texts and writers who reinforce prejudice against them with contemptuous laughter. By learning to laugh at those who would degrade them, women and girls can then take a first step towards cultivating the skills they would need to become independent social, political, and economic actors. So by briefly reconstructing these two chapters, what I really want to do is highlight the major contributions of Uncivil Mirth. In beautiful, and I think it has to be said, frequently hilarious prose. I thought the book itself was very funny in points, which is quite apt. Ross shows us that ridicule was a widely used, but also a deeply contested rhetorical resource for thinkers and actors across the political spectrum in 18th century Britain. And I think the source materials that Ross uses to make this case are sometimes unexpected, but also incredibly well chosen. Readers, and by readers I mean me, might assume that they would find Swift or Mandeville as the most prominent figures in a study like this, but I think Ross sort of keeps them largely in the background in favor of devoting more consideration to rich multi-author Scottish debates about common life and pressing political controversies. And I think that this choice really pays off well. So I think I am nearing the end of my time. So let me just close with this, which is that I think that Uncivil Mirth will really repay careful attention from many types of scholars, political theorists, intellectual historians, and scholars of rhetoric who specialize in 18th century political discourse, especially. I think this is really a book for us in many ways. But at the same time, and without slipping into anachronism, I think that Ross sets a very demanding agenda for contemporary politics as well, which is figuring out how to harness the undeniable force of ridicule for emancipatory political purposes, while keeping a very close watch on its potential to undermine these very same ends. So I'd like to conclude by just saying thank you, Ross, for this very welcome political charge, as well as for all of the deep work that you did with the 18th century sources, which I loved so much. So congratulations.
Thank you, Emily. Brilliant, brilliant comments. I love this Ross Carroll Love Fest. I wish we could have one every week. We should. The reading group is now Ross Carroll group because there is so much to say.